Hi, everyone. I am excited. This is the interview about Norm Mineta. So, Eric Federing was Norm's right hand when it came to communications while Norm was in office in Congress. And the stories that Eric tells are just compelling. And it just describes and brings to light so many pivotal moments and just intrinsically how Norm would always show up trying to make sure that he honored the person across from him in the conversation. And as a result, he thrived on making sure that he created allies because the view was everyone's story matters and together our stories are better. So I hope you get as inspired as I did with this conversation with Eric, and I hope it helps your leadership story. Enjoy. Hi, everyone. I'm very excited to bring you this interview to talk about Norm Mineta. And I'm especially excited because Eric Federing has been a mentor for more years than we want to count, and a sage voice that I have been very blessed to have as part of my circle of trusted advisors. So we need to talk about Secretary Mineta, who I know you're going to correct me and say Norm very quickly. So before we talk about him, can you lead me up to the moment, Eric, where you actually get to meet him? And then we can start on all the amazing Norm stories that I know you've got tucked away.
Thank you for being so kind, and thank you for inviting me to talk about Norm, which is always a singular pleasure for me. I met Norm by answering a blind ad. At the time, I was looking for press secretary on Capitol Hill, and there was something called the Democratic Study Group, which had blind job listings. And I read one, it kind of read interestingly to me, and I applied for it. And then I got a call from Norm's chief of staff wanting to meet with me. Now, around that same time, I'd had some publicity for something I was doing independently that made the front page of the style section of the Washington Post. So I think she realized that I could actually handle myself in front of the press just about an E. Question was, and Susie Smith's her name, was very intuitive, as I later came to appreciate, the hiring people. She was always looking for people with a sense of enterprise and collaboration and so forth. And I quickly came to understand why. She was reflecting the person she was working for, and that was kind of Norm's style. So I was called. I got an interview, first with her and then with her and Norm. And I can't, to this day, tell you why things clicked the way they did. Because when you're press secretary, spokesperson, speechwriter, it's arguably one of the most personalized things in politics or in anything, honestly. But here was someone 40 years my senior, different coasts, different backgrounds, different everything. It was just something, he understood each other. And when I was made the offer to become his press secretary, I remember Susie saying, when can you be here? I said, when do you want me? I mean, I'll make it my business to be here. And that was the beginning. It's just a remarkable adventure that started out obviously as employer-employee and quickly became mentor, and over time became friend, and over time became extended family. And it's nothing he could have ever charted from the beginning. It was just something quite organic.
So one of the things I want to bring into the story is when I called you to say, would you be willing? And let me take a step back. Normally, when I call you and ask you questions, you are wonderfully balanced and measured. This was not that response. This was, I couldn't finish the sentence, and you said yes before I ended a sentence or the question. And I think that speaks to how strongly you feel about his story and how it needs to be told, and how there's such richness in what currently it can be translated of who he is and how he showed up as an American. So, okay, now you're here, you've gotten the job offer. Why don't we take a step back and tell me then, where does Norm's story start to then catch up of when you meet him as a congressman?
First on that point about the joy of talking about him, some of us were constantly on his back about, will you please write an autobiography? Will help. He didn't think his story was that interesting. He was wrong. That's one of the few things I can say without fear of contradiction. I think he was wrong about that. So where, my story began and merged with his. You gotta go back to where his story began. His story began with his parents who emigrated from Japan in the early part of last century. His father was going to be a farmer and wound up getting off in a northern state and then in the West Coast and then migrating down to California. He became ill and he couldn't be a farmer. So he opened a small insurance agency in San Jose, California, and became, part of the community that way. So I think from that time and the time of Norm and his siblings, he was the youngest of five. There was always a strong sense of community and family, which I think anchored him in his youth, his youngest years. And then, of course, comes the Empire of Japan attacks the U.S. at Pearl Harbor. Japanese Americans fall under this cloud, and that led to many really tragic, unpleasant things, including the internment of 120,000 Japanese Americans during the Second World War in 10 camps that were spread around mostly the Western U.S. But nevertheless, there was that still sense of family and community. I mean, they were in a camp in Heart Mountain, Wyoming, and this was a young boy who was a Cub Scout.
Because I'm gonna pause you because one of the reasons when I've heard you tell this story, you've always said it or when you've spoken and represented it to other organizations, you say you wanted to paint a picture of him in his uniform with whatever baseball glove, baseball bat, because that's who he was as somebody who is, regardless of ancestry, American, and now he's being taken away from his home to go to Wyoming.
Yeah, well, first, they were all told they had to leave by a certain date and show up at the rail station in San Jose, which they did. And there were some divisions within the Japanese American community that they knew this was wrong, but do you cooperate? Do you resist? I mean, this was not the civil rights era of the 1960s, and this was a community that, culturally was rather conservative, very cohesive, and they were often told they had to sell their things. There was only so much they could bring. As an aside, because I know we're going to talk about allyship, I'm going to come back to this. There was an attorney in that part of Santa Clara County, name of Peckham, who agreed to hold a lot of properties belonging to Japanese Americans in trust. And of course, he had a reputation. It was a good reputation, but are we going to be taken to the cleaners? What happened? He held the trust for them until they came back after the war. He later became a judge. There's a courthouse named for him. So there were people all over the place that knew this was wrong, but there was not. The Japanese American community did not have the power of a voice to make any kind of difference at that time. So here's Norm, this 10-and-a-half-year-old boy, wearing his Cub Scout uniform and with his baseball glove and ball and bat, going down to the rail station before he and his family were put on trains. All the windows were covered over. You didn't really know where you were going. And they took his bat and his ball because they thought, well, it could be a weapon. So the first place they were taken to was the Santa Anita racetrack. It was set up as a temporary course. So they're going from San Jose all the way south to Santa Anita, where lots of people were living in horse stables, basically, for 6 months until these camps the 10 camps were built by the War Relocation Administration. And he and his family were taken to the one in Heart Mountain, Wyoming. The closest city there is Cody, Wyoming. It was just basically a flat plain within sight of Heart Mountain. So they were all living in rude tarred paper barracks and things like that. And nevertheless, the Japanese American community still tried to conduct some sense of normalcy in an abnormal, unjustified circumstance. They kept the Cub Scout and Boy Scout units going, as an example. These camps were huge. The two that were in Arizona were at that time effectively the second and third largest cities in Arizona. That's how large they were. So, this is a totally surreal environment. And yet, Norm was in a very strong family. Uh, his father was actually released early to go to Chicago to teach Japanese to Army service people. So, I mean, this is bizarre. You're doing that, and your family is still behind barbed wire.
There aren't very many moments in anybody's life, this is the extreme examples, where it's really, that Hollywood clear moment, because I'm not gonna get the words exactly right, but I remember reading a quote
Mm.
that I think his father said where he was confused on why the country of his birth was attacking the country of his heart. And like anything that you care about, you have to if you really care and it's something in your heart, you have to give a little. I'm not saying a lot of latitude, I'm not saying complete forgiveness, but if it's really something that's in your heart in any relationship, then they continue to say, "I'm gonna sign up for this. This isn't what it should be, but" and I'm gonna fast forward, I need to be part of the solution. Let's stay here because even in those moments in the Cub Scouts, is it too soon to talk about Alan?
I mean, this is something, again, is a Hollywood story, and it's not. As I said, they kept the Cub Scouts and Boy Scouts going in the camp, and the scoutmaster got in contact with the local Boy Scout troop in Cody and invited them in for a jamboree because they couldn't leave the camp. They agreed to do that. Oh, for like, no, I can't think, it was like a long weekend or something like that. And as is tradition in scouting, you get paired up with someone from the other troop. So he gets paired up with someone that Norm described as sort of this, you know, fat, tall kid. And he knew Alan Simpson later in life. He was anything but fat. He was very tall. So he gets paired up with him. And as Simpson would later say, he said, "Why are you guys in here? You told the same dirty jokes we do. What's the difference?" He didn't get it's, you get kids together and
They
if
see past.
they can at least. And that was the case. So one of the things that bonded them was there was one kid in Simpson's troop who was just a bully. He couldn't stand him. And so one of the things you do in scouting is you pitch your own pup tent. And they did that. And Simpson said to Nora, "Can we channel the water and drain system in case it rains, so that if it does rain, it goes right down to the tent with the kid that Simpson didn't like?" Or as he poured, and it got washed out, and they both thought that was the funniest thing on the planet. So, they bonded over a very brief period of time as, then 12-year-olds. And I think they had some holiday cards going after the war for a period of time, and that kind of stopped. And then Simpson, this is in like the early 1970s, became an attorney. He read when Norm had become the first Japanese American mayor of a major American city in 1971 on the mainland. There were ones in Hawaii. So it made national news, and Simpson read about that and sent Norm a congratulations card. And then a few years later, Norm got elected to the House. 78, I think, Simpson was elected to the Senate. So they resumed contact, and here they are. They're working. They're different political parties. Although, like a lot of many Japanese Americans started out as Republicans, particularly when you have a Democratic president who's kind of responsible for the internment and those policies. They're not going to gravitate towards that party. But over time, that began to shift. Norm said that it was JFK that shifted him from the Republican to the Democratic Party. So their politics were quite different, but the humanity wasn't. And that's a very powerful thing to remember, is that, politics is a point of view. It's not necessarily a life or a cult or a gang. And between the two of them, they were just friends. They were friends from the time they were 12. And when I learned of this story, it was in 1988. By then, legislation was moving through Congress to offer redress for the internment. And I can't remember exactly what had happened, but it was mentioned to me one day. I said, "Where is the story?" "Well, I've never read anything about this. And one of my prouder moments early on in my career was getting this really nice story and a really great photo of the two of them in the New York Times, because it was just so emblematic of what ordinarily should be the art of the possible between and among people.
Especially American people.
Yeah, that's right. And they were just fast friends. They actually disagreed on some elements of the redress legislation, about the compensation payment in particular, not necessarily about the apology. But they started to do more and more things together, particularly after they retired from Congress. And there is now at Hart Mountain, there is the Mineta Simpson Center, which is all about bringing people together. But the thing I came to appreciate about Norm throughout was his humanity and the fact that, you would think easily that coming out of an experience like the internment, rancor, bitterness, and it was true with some Japanese Americans to be sure, but a distinct minority. There was an ethic that said, in the aftermath, what happened to us should never happen to anybody else ever again.
Well, and let's use those moments because, you've mentioned to it, and I've also heard it's all about why did this happen? Not that it did happen, but why did this happen? And we didn't have a voice, so we need to fix that part. So let's fast forward. Norm gets out. He goes to college. He joins the army.
He was in the army during the Korean War, stationed in Japan as an interpreter. At that time, a number of things had happened. There was the Japanese American Citizens League, and actually his became a relative and in-law named Mike Masaoka also led an effort to have a Property Claims Act enacted in Congress, which happened in, if I'm not mistaken, 1948, which is very soon after the war. And so some people started to realize that this was simply wrong. I mean, those who applied, I think, got pennies on the dollar, but they did get something. But what Japanese Americans in particular realized is we didn't have a great voice. Maybe it wouldn't have mattered, but without it, someone else is defining you.
Can we restate that? Because I think that's very important, is you can't let someone else tell your story.
No. You have to at least attempt to be in charge of your own narrative. There was a leader in the South San Francisco Bay community, in the Japanese American community. His name was Ike Ishimatsu. And he had the idea, we've got to get involved in politics. We've got to start buying tables at political dinners and things like that, so that they were visible. And visible not just within the Japanese American community, but visible in the community at large. Things like that, step by step. And to make a difference, the Japanese American Citizens League became more active in a number of ways. And ultimately, I think it was in 1978, voted to formally seek redress for the internment. Now, even as early as that, there was some primordial legislation introduced in Congress along those same lines. And there were some divisions. Some said, no, the courts allowed this. We have to get the court cases right. And some people held that was more important than getting an apology from Congress. The truth is that we're kind of on two parallel tracks, sometimes jockeying a little bit for position. But the courts were slow, and so was the political movement. But it was also important that, on the subject of allyship, that it was not just a Japanese American initiative. It had allies. If my memory is correct, the first person who introduced legislation for redress was a congressman from Washington State named Mike Lowry, who was not Japanese American. But that community in Washington State, there was also a very significant Japanese American part of this community. And that was I think the secret sauce was you need allies from outside the community that's been wrong, that's to agree, yeah, this was wrong. How can we help you can't make it right, but how can we help you with what your goals are now by way of teaching the history, apologizing for it, trying to ensure that it doesn't happen again. There was a point where, this is a classic example, when they were going around in the later 1980s to mid to late 80s to get sponsors, because the legislation didn't go anywhere for a long time. It was held up in committee, and Congress was pretty rigorous about following rules about committees taking action and so forth. But it wasn't going anywhere. And then Norm and his legislative directors, this is before I was on the scene, his legislative director, it's named Glenn Roberts. They went to see the Speaker of the House, Jim Wright of Texas. Would he agree to be a leading co-sponsor of the legislation? And Wright started to tell this story, which of course is not terribly well known outside of the Japanese American community. But during the war, there were Japanese Americans in the camps who volunteered to go into military service, all of which initially was directed at Europe for a variety of reasons. And it was fairly legendary for 42nd Regimental Combat.
Yeah.
And one of the actions that team, it was the most decorated military team of that size in American history because of everything they did in Europe. One of the things they did was to rescue what became known as the Lost Battalion from Texas. So Texans knew the story. They knew the history. Jim Wright, story, he was a World War II veteran himself. He signed on easily. Norma told the story that after the meeting, he and Glenn walked out the door. They were just screaming, shouting for joy. They couldn't believe it.
Because they didn't know that moment. It was
They did not know how deeply affected he had been by it as a World War II vet and as a Texan. Some years later, and I'm really jumping around here a little bit, many years later, when I was a member of the Japanese American Memorial Foundation, aware of this history, and the 65th anniversary of that rescue occurred, it said to my fellow board members, we got to do something with this. This is too easy, and it would be almost criminal not to do something.
the Texans want you to.
So held a huge reunion down in Houston, which was one of the most moving things I think I'd ever been to. Because you did have a lot of veterans, and just seeing the photos of the Texans and the Japanese Americans was really very moving. But the entirety of the programming, you had the Bill Mullen, who I believe was chairman of the Joint Chiefs at that point, he attended. It was extraordinary, but it spoke volumes about people and allyship
And showing up and just realizing we're all humans and seeing past it. I'm only going to interject just to give you a moment to breathe. I'm glad you brought up the 442nd, because if you talk about a moment where you gave me an opportunity that still makes me get teary when I think about it, it's because once I got to know you, this is the Congressional Medal Award dinner where they honored the 442nd. And I am sitting there, and I will just say, I don't think I told you this story. So I'm there at the table watching all this happening, hearing the stories. It's palpable because the number of veterans there were even veterans who showed up who did not live out after the dinner was over. Like, it was so impactful. Yeah. We're going to jump around Norm's story because there's so much to jump around. But not only are we having this conversation, but we're going to say in a second how Norm became Secretary of Transportation. Remind me of the general who was at the table, because I keep forgetting. So I'm going to tell the story, and you're probably going to remember by the end. So Norm comes over, and he's within earshot.
Shinseki, was it?
It might have been because they were talking about 9/11.
It might have been Shinseki.
And we're about to tell the arc, but I'm going to give a teaser of the story. We're going to start talking about Norm's story, right? We're talking about how the Japanese American community continue to show up to be Americans, and Norm's story and Norm's arc of the story. And to think that he's going to tell about to that general, and I only could get every other word of him telling how he ordered the planes down on 9/11 and what he did afterwards because of his arc and his experience to honor what was about to happen in America after 9/11. I'm still to this day, hairs on the back of my neck, because I could not think of a moment that is more like moving to me as an American to see, because we're about to talk about somebody who's gone through this. He's starting his young adult life. He's now served in Korea, like you said, being an interpreter. Now he comes back, and the voices he has in his head are the community saying, we need to get involved. We need sponsors, and we need to tell our voice, but we need to honor the humanity of the people around us.
Always. A thing about Norm that I observed was that you might disagree about something. I might disagree with another member, something about policy or politics, what have you. It was never disagreeable. and was never personal about it in the disagreement. I think he realized early on that you got to accomplish something, you got to collaborate, you got to work with people and for people and people across the aisle. And it's, there were some things, for example, this is not terribly well known, but after Clinton was elected president, and Norm flew down to Little Rock. I didn't actually find out about this until after I think he was there. Not that I should have, because Clinton was seriously thinking about offering him the job of Secretary of Transportation at that point. Because Norm by then had become so well regarded as very substantive, and transportation is typically not partisan. There's no such thing as a Republican or Democratic exit ramp. I mean, it's infrastructure with a purpose. And he was about to become then chair of the Public Works and Transportation Committee. And he basically said to Clinton and said, quite honestly, I could probably be more help to you here than I would be in the cabinet right now, because I believe in what you want to try to do and all the rest of that. You got to work it through Congress. So he declined at that point. Now, fast forward about 7.5 years, there was an opening at the Commerce Department. And I know this because I got a call from my former chief of staff. This was in 2000, and I was by then working for a senator, saying that the White House wanted to talk with Norm. He was at an event over at the Washington Hilton. We know you live like a block away. Can you go fish?
You were asked to flag him?
Yeah. So I brought him over to my condo, which my wife and I just got married. We were surrounded by what I would call the towers of loot, only just boxes on all this stuff. And Norm starts talking with Susie about what's being notion. So I was kind of there at the takeoff of that. And it's like, what can I do to help? Honestly, it was just that simple. But I was so thrilled for him and frankly for the country that by then Norm was an executive of Lockheed Martin, been there for about 5 years at that point. I would routinely tell people, no, he's not and never going to be forgotten. He treated people too respectfully, universally so in my observation of them, when it came to doing his job. But Norm had a congenital talent for remembering people. It's nothing you could actually learn. He remembered everybody. I'm jumping around here, but when he retired from Congress and I put together, it was a huge dinner in San Jose, and I put together a tribute video. One of the things I wanted to make sure was called out is that I never forgot their names, because he didn't. So, when you're a member of Congress, at least back then, it's before the internet and what have you, you're dealing with inundation of mail, postcards, organized by this group or that, and individual letters and so forth. He insisted on signing everyone himself and that everyone be personalized, which drove staff crazy. Finally, he agreed on topic A, if that's all it was. Okay, I'll pre-approve this form letter, but he still insisted on signing them all himself. And there would be a stack on his desk of mail, and because he would write notes at the bottom because he remembered everybody, remembered their kids. He just was like that. And he wanted people to genuinely feel connected to their government and their government representative through him. I saw this firsthand in so many different ways. He used to take constituents to lunch. As a matter of fact, when he retired from Congress, I did a back of the envelope calculation based on some years and some things I was told that he'd taken about 11,000 constituents to lunch in the Capitol building over a little more than 20 years. And this is the story I personally love to tell. You can cut it out, but indulge me anyway. Either my first or second trip to San Jose, where I'd never been before he hired me. That shows you the level of trust he had in me. Don't know why it was there. I'm grateful that it was, and I like to think I reciprocated. If you have strawberries here in the East that are from California, they're good, but there's nothing like a ripe California strawberry in California. And one day someone had brought some back after coming back from the district. And I said, wow, what is this? So I got it into my head. I'm going to bring a whole flat back of strong. Where do you go? Where's the best place to go? Well, at that time, there was a greengrocer that had been around for generations in Campbell, California. It's called Cosentino's. So I get in there. I mean, the prices are so cheap that I can bring a flat and I'll figure out how to get it on the plane. And I see this elaborate sign hanging down from the ceiling over the cashier I went to about their check writing policy. I didn't have my ATM card. I had a little bit of cash on me. They didn't take credit cards, but I did have my checkbook. So I explained to the cashier, I showed him my congressional ID, which I could have probably whipped up at home myself at that point, but it was my ID. I said, I work for Norm. Is there any ways, only like $11. Can I write a check for her? I said, okay, I'll call my manager over. While we're waiting for the manager, she tells me this story. I said, I know Norm.
This is the cashier.
This is the cashier. I know Norm. We went to Washington, had a visit. He took us up to the gallery. We had lunch in the members' dining room. He then took us on the floor. And I would tell Norm, that's why you get reelected. You're Norm to everybody. You're not Norm with a letter indicating a party after your name. You're not some disconnected, disassociated creature that people.
You're a human.
You're a human being. And you treat people like human beings.
What happened to the strawberries?
Got them on the plane, the airline. I'll give them a plug. It was United. They made me package them up in another box, and they said, okay.
Doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter. I'll get them there. But to me, that story, that experience just crystallized everything. Why he signed every letter himself, wrote notes.
Yes.
Why he went back to California 2-3 times a month, which, that's a real body challenge, flying from Washington and taking red eyes and all the rest of it. People felt that they knew him. He never forgot where he came from.
Because he always knew that their voice mattered. Like, let's talk about it. He was always coming at it, not to just, because I think there are people who can listen to the story and you say he goes through the motions. So he came from a place of, your voice matters. So I'm going to want to hear your voice. I want to hear your story. The story I want you to tell is, I don't know all the specifics, but you ran into somebody in the halls of Congress, and once you told them that you're with Norm, you know where I'm going with this? Because then we talk about the allyship. So there's a story of he wanted everyone's voice to be heard, but when you talk, because you said it before, that everybody needs supporters and everybody needs allies.
He's passed now, so I feel I can tell this story and just kind of use his name. It was a congressman from Indiana, a conservative Republican. His name was John Myers. Been in Congress, would have been like his 10th term. I didn't know him. He was an appropriator, which is sort of a separate world on Capitol Hill. He had been in line to become chair of the appropriations after the Republicans won a House for the first time in 40 years in 1994. But he'd been passed over. And I ran into him. I'm on the opposite side of the aisle. We're all still kind of in shell shock, being suddenly in the minority, but civility hadn't left the building. And I knew who he was, and I ran into him at the members' elevator. No, I was not going to get on myself because I wasn't one. But I ran into him, and I said, Congressman, I said, how you doing? I introduced myself. I said, my name, I work for Norm Mineta. And the only thing I can conclude about everything that followed is there was something about Norm's name that just sort of rang with him. We didn't know each other, know whether I was posing as someone. We just didn't know it. He was also incredibly frustrated. And he started venting. He started to say, what used to be around here at the end of the day, you and your spouse would go out to dinner with another member and their spouse. And it didn't matter what political party you were part of, you had something in common, whatever it was. And you went out for dinner. He said, now you have people looking over your shoulder. And he'll say, you were seen last night having dinner with so-and-so. What was that all about? He hated that. That was not in key. And I had no idea why he told me that. I
think you do, because you know that that's how.
And it's the only thing I can conclude, but I'm not sure I do now.
Yeah.
But it's the thought that's stuck with me all these years. Norm was just that respected across the aisle, which was also essential too when it came to moving the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. It couldn't be a purely partisan thing. it wouldn't have had the same, even if it would have been enacted and you had a Republican president then and Ronald Reagan, even had it been enacted, if it was purely partisan coming out of Congress, which it wasn't, there would always have been a say, oh, that was a Democratic thing or a Republican thing. And for this, you didn't want that. It wouldn't have been as effective because there were so many different components to legislation. There were certainly the apology, the offer of compensation to those who were still alive or their parents or their children, so forth. But there was also a strong educational component in it, which led to the memorial, which we'll talk about in a minute. So it was a comprehensive thought package. What should make a difference here? Beyond us, what is it about our story that we want to communicate that has a larger meaning to, the American culture and
Which you need
history,
allies for.
which you need allies for. So ironically, here you have someone who was in Norm, who at first went into business with his father, then started to seek local office, became mayor of San Jose, elected to Congress, went into the corporate world for about 5 years, and became Secretary of Commerce under Clinton and Secretary of Transportation under Bush.
Wait, stop and emphasize that.
Yeah, it's not common. It's quite rare that, and it was also continuous. It wasn't a break service. Before I get to the story about transportation, which is also one point about the show, if you were to ask Norm, and I did, what was your favorite job? You know which one he would say? Mayor of San Jose. To be mayor of your hometown, that you had to leave.
Yeah.
As a kid. Think about that.
But he could come back and take care of the people who needed the voices.
And be on the ground. You're not removed.
No.
Doing a job which has an impact, but you're there every day. You're taking all the slings and arrows, but you're also there for the ribbon cuttings, but you're there to help build your hometown. That's why you're there. And even he would acknowledge at that point, there were some mistakes that they made. It was sort of popular, a lot of urban renewal schemes, just knock everything down, build something new. He said, no, that was the wrong way to do it. Which he realized later on. So, he knew he wasn't not the font of all knowledge. That's not the point. The point was he wanted to find people who collectively would be the font of all knowledge and try to get things done right in a way that would last. It wouldn't be ephemeral or anything like that. So by the time the 2000 election, very controversial result, comes out, and he's there as Commerce Secretary in the last 6 months of Clinton's second term. Andy Card, who was going to be the White House Chief of Staff, had been Secretary of Transportation earlier in a Republican administration. So he knew Norm. And they also knew that, having someone from the party opposite in the cabinet at that time could have a healing effect, given how divisive that election was. So he was asked to stay on. And if you go back and look in the record, if my memory is correct, he was actually approved by the Senate during his nomination era. Thinks that we can move this through right now. He's already been vetted for Commerce.
Yeah.
And they want to keep him on. It was just remarkable, but it just spoke volumes about the esteem in which he was held.
Well, and there's so much more to tell about it, but let's talk about Secretary of Transportation. Why don't we start the story with what you messaged him on 9/11?
Well, I'll be candid. I messaged, you know how I felt about this election, but I'm so glad you're there. If there was anybody I would want to see in that position at that moment, it was Norm. He lived and breathed transportation, and not in an isolated roads and bridges and transit, as a holistic thing that was an economic engine. It was lots of different things, but he had, this was before 9/11 when he was in Congress, he had a flight deck pass from the FAA. So when he was doing his shuttles back and forth, he could actually go into the cockpit. Or if he wasn't in the cockpit, he was listening to air traffic control all the way across country. That was on flights while he was doing that. He was just that, he was enamored of it because of what it was capable of, but also its importance for safety, moving people and goods, the economy, you name it. It was a big cause and much larger part of our society. So he saw things in those terms. So if there was anybody I wanted to see in a particular job at that moment in time, it was Norm.
Because you know he's invested in that moment.
For whatever it's worth, I mean, I slept just that much more easily. It was that particular moment in time that just galvanized everything I believed. That if there was anyone born to do a particular job at a particular moment in time,
It was him.
and there have been others in American history, but that was the right thing.
I think one of the things I didn't appreciate as much, and I'm so glad I got to revisit his story through this, is because his voice when he raised it afterwards, an advocation of what could happen as a reaction to 9/11. If you talk about fated, right? If there's any voice that needed to be the strongest to be a member of the administration to say no more, he did.
After the attacks and the anti-Islamic, anti-Muslim sentiment was just off the charts in the country. And it was President Bush at that meeting that said, no, we cannot allow what happened to Norm and Chinese Americans
To happen again.
to happen to Muslim Americans. Bush said that. His presence at that time embodied an American ethic. Or said, we made some really serious mistakes. We don't want to do that again. So if my memory is accurate, around that same time, President Bush went to Islamic centers and so forth, and he did such the right thing at that point, because who knows what would have happened absent that, if it had been allowed to just, run away by itself. So that's what I mean. Here was this presence that was not symbolic. It was there by merit and the fact that people knew and had worked with him for any different capacities over the years. But he represented other things. He used to say that he would get more grief in cabinet meetings for being from California than he'd been for being a Democrat. So, everybody, there are senses of humor that are not attacking, and he would have fun with that. But his is a story of how, like this says, patriotism, perseverance, and posterity. That's associated with the memorial, but I'd say fairly, he lived by that ethic. He lived by that ethic of accountability and accessibility.
And to make sure people's voices were heard.
He saw the country, people use the term melting pot, which went around forever. He saw it as a tapestry of different peoples and cultures and history and what have you. And the tapestry can really be very strong, and often has been very strong. It's also had its weaknesses. The internment is an example of that. But when you look around at the American tapestry, it's one of those things that gives the country its strength in so many different dimensions. That's the way he saw things. And I think that played out in every element of public service that he committed himself to.
Well, I really hope this motivates people to learn more about him, because we haven't even scratched the surface. Like, if you listen to any of his speeches, it is, like you said, it shows the tapestry of how you should think about it. So, Eric, thank you for telling his story. I hope you have all enjoyed it. I hope you can apply some of this to your story. And stick around. We're going to do a bonus episode on the Japanese memorial as well. Talk to you soon.